Barron Trump was walking through a busy street in New York City, blending in as much as he could. A simple black baseball cap covered his recognizable face, and he kept his head down, focused on his own thoughts. The city buzzed around him, horns blaring, street vendors shouting, groups of tourists laughing as they snapped photos. It was just another afternoon in Manhattan, and no one seemed to notice him. Until they did. Out of nowhere, a figure moved quickly behind him. Before Barron could react, the person reached out, snatched the cap right off his head, and darted into the crowd. The moment felt surreal. A rush of air where his hat had been, the sensation of movement just behind him, the sudden murmur of voices around him as people noticed what had happened. A couple of bystanders gasped. One woman pointed in shock, while others just stood there, unsure if they had really seen what they thought they saw. For a brief second, Barron remained still, his hair tousled from the motion of the cap being yanked away. He blinked, processing what had just happened. Most people in his position would have shouted, maybe called for security or chased after the thief, but Barron did none of those things. Instead, he took a slow, deep breath. His expression didn't change. There was no flash of anger, no sign of panic, just a quiet moment of thought, as if he were deciding something. He turned his head slightly, watching the direction the stranger had run off to. The crowd was thick, but he could still catch glimpses of movement weaving through people. Bystanders were still whispering, some pulling out their phones, expecting some kind of reaction. But Barron didn't raise his voice, didn't demand his hat back. Instead, he started walking, not running, not pushing through the crowd in a frantic chase, just walking, calmly, deliberately, his eyes scanning ahead. People around him exchanged confused glances. They had expected outrage, maybe some kind of spectacle. But this was something else entirely. And as Barron disappeared deeper into the crowd, following the path of the thief, those watching couldn't shake the feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. Barron kept his pace steady, weaving through the crowd without rushing. He wasn't chasing the thief. He was following him. His expression remained unreadable, his mind sharp, calculating his next move. Around him, whispers grew. A few people had their phones out, recording, expecting to witness a confrontation. But Barron wasn't giving them that. He wasn't going to turn this into a spectacle. A couple of blocks ahead, he finally spotted the thief. The young man had stopped near a bench, his chest rising and falling quickly as he caught his breath. He clutched the stolen cap in his hands, gripping the fabric tightly, as if it held some kind of significance beyond just being a hat. Barron didn't hesitate. He walked straight up to him, stopping just a few feet away. The young man hadn't noticed him yet, too lost in his own head, too distracted by whatever had driven him to do this in the first place. And then, in a calm, measured voice, Barron spoke. "Was it worth it?" The young man jolted at the sound, his head snapping up. His fingers twitched around the hat, his eyes darting around as if expecting security or an angry confrontation. But there was none. Just Barron standing there, hands in his pockets, watching him with quiet curiosity instead of rage. For a moment, the young man looked stunned. He had expected yelling. He had expected threats, maybe even a call for the police. But this caught him completely off guard. Barron took another step closer, his tone still even. "You really needed to do that?" The young man hesitated. He swallowed hard, his grip on the cap loosening slightly. His expression was shifting, no longer cocky, no longer amused. There was something else there now, something almost like regret. Barron tilted his head slightly, waiting, not pushing, just letting the weight of the moment settle. The young man sighed, finally looking away, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to prove something." Barron raised an eyebrow. "Prove what?" The young man hesitated again, then exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That you're just like everyone says, that you'd lose it, that you'd act entitled." Barron blinked, taking in the words. And then, slowly, he nodded. "So, you stole my hat, just to see how I'd react?" The young man looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "Yeah." Barron let out a small breath, But he didn't look angry. If anything, he looked like he understood something that no one else did. Barron let the young man's words hang in the air, his eyes never leaving him. The weight of the confession settled between them, but instead of reacting with anger or frustration, Barron just stood there, considering it. "You really thought I'd make a scene?" he finally asked, his voice calm. The young man still wouldn't meet his gaze. His fingers fidgeted with the cap, twisting the fabric between his hands. "I don't know," he admitted. People expect you to act a certain way. I wanted to see if it was true." Barron exhaled through his nose, a slow, thoughtful breath. He could have snapped back, could have told him how ridiculous that was, how unfair it was to test someone like that, but instead he simply asked, "And?" The young man hesitated, then shook his head. "You didn't do what I thought you would." A small smirk tugged at the corner of Barron's lips, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was more like understanding. "So," he said, "you stole my hat, ran off, and now you're just sitting here with it. What was the plan after this?" The young man looked down at the cap in his hands, like he was seeing it for the first time. He shrugged. "I don't know. I didn't think that far." Barron tilted his head slightly, watching him. This wasn't just some random thief. This was someone who was searching for something. Validation, maybe, or just proof that the world worked the way he thought it did. "I don't get it," Barron said finally. "If you wanted to prove something, why not just ask me a question instead of stealing from me?" The young man let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Would you have answered?" Barron thought about that. Maybe he wouldn't have, if the approach had been different. Maybe he would have just kept walking, dismissing it as another random stranger with an agenda. But now he was standing here, having this conversation. He took a step closer, looking the young man in the eyes. "What's your name?" The young man hesitated before muttering, "Ryan." Barron nodded, as if filing that away. "Well, Ryan," he said, his voice even, "you've got my hat. You wanted to prove something. Now you have your answer." Ryan swallowed, his fingers loosening around the cap. His shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his action settling in. He looked up at Barron, uncertainty in his expression, and then, slowly, without being asked, he held the hat back out. Barron looked at the cap in Ryan's outstretched hand but didn't take it immediately. He studied the young man's face, seeing something deeper than just regret. This wasn't about a hat. It never had been. Ryan swallowed hard. "Here," he muttered. "I shouldn't have done that." Barron crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "Why did you, though?" Ryan sighed and shook his head. "I don't know. I guess I just wanted to get a reaction. I've seen people say stuff about you, about your family. I thought maybe you'd prove them right." Barron stayed quiet for a moment. Then he took a slow breath. "And did I?" Ryan gave a small, humorless chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "You actually did the opposite." Barron finally reached for the cap, but instead of putting it back on his head, he turned it over in his hands, staring at it thoughtfully. "People assume a lot of things," he said, his voice steady. "They think they know who someone is just because of a name or where they come from. You wanted to test me, but what about you? What do people assume about you?" Ryan blinked, caught off guard by the question. He shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, that I'm just some nobody, that I don't matter." He let out a breath, shaking his head. "That's kind of why I did it, I guess. It's stupid, but for a second, I had control. For a second, people were watching me." Barron let his fingers tighten around the hat. He understood more than he let on. You don't have to take something from someone else to be seen. Ryan looked down, his jaw tensing. Barron took a step closer and held the cap out, not taking it back, but offering it back. "Here." Ryan frowned in confusion. "What?" "Keep it," Barron said, his tone matter of fact. "But if you wear it, make sure you do something good with it." Ryan stared at him, speechless. The weight of the moment settled in. Barron wasn't just forgiving him. He was giving him something instead. A second chance. A new meaning to something that had started with a mistake. Slowly, Ryan reached out and took the cap. His grip was careful, as if it were heavier than before. "Why are you doing this?" Barron simply shrugged. "Because I can." Ryan had no response. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he had stolen something, or if he had just been given more than he ever expected. Ryan stood there, holding the cap in his hands, his fingers gripping the fabric like it meant something more than just a stolen item now. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. His face was a mix of confusion, disbelief, and something he couldn't quite place, something unfamiliar. Barron saw it. He had seen it before, in himself, in others. That moment when everything you thought you knew about the world shifted just enough to make you question yourself. "I don't get it," Ryan finally muttered. "You should be pissed. I took something from you. You could have called security, could have embarrassed me in front of everyone. But you're just letting it go?" Barron gave a small shrug. "What would that do?" Ryan blinked, caught off guard. Sure, I could have made a scene," Barron continued. "Could have gotten mad, could have made sure everyone knew what you did. But then what? You'd walk away the same person you were before, and I'd still be here, just a little more frustrated than I was 5 minutes ago." Ryan stared at him, absorbing the words. Barron sighed. "You wanted to test me, to see if I'd prove the things people say about me. But now you've got a different answer, don't you?" Ryan nodded slowly. Barron tilted his head. "So, what are you going to do with it?" Ryan looked down at the cap in his hands, his throat tightening. He had taken it as a way to get attention, to prove something, to make someone else look bad just so. For once he could feel like he had control over something. But now, standing here, it didn't feel like a prize. It felt like a lesson. He swallowed hard. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think I need to figure that out." Barron nodded, satisfied. "Good." Ryan looked up at him again, hesitation flickering across his face. "Listen, man, Barron shook his head, cutting him off gently. "It's fine," Ryan exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't think anyone's ever done something like this for me before." Barron smirked, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. "Maybe that's why you thought you had to take something instead of just asking." Ryan nodded slowly, the realization settling deep. He clutched the cap, but this time not as something stolen, something given, something that meant something now. Ryan stood there, still gripping the cap, the weight of the moment settling deeper than he had expected. The crowd that had gathered around them wasn't whispering anymore. People weren't looking at him like a troublemaker, a nobody trying to get attention. They were looking at him like something had shifted, like he had been given a chance to be someone different than he had been just minutes ago. Barron adjusted his sleeves, glancing around before looking back at Ryan. "You don't have to keep proving yourself like this," he said simply. "Not like this." Ryan swallowed hard. "I don't really know how else to do it." Barron studied him for a second, then nodded toward the cap in Ryan's hands. "Then maybe start with that." Ryan looked down at the hat again. It wasn't just a stolen souvenir anymore. It was a reminder, a moment that could either mean nothing or change everything. Barron took a small step back, ready to leave. He had nothing more to say. He had already done what most people in his position wouldn't have. He had met anger with patience, disrespect with understanding. And now, the rest was up to Ryan. The young man exhaled, his grip on the cap tightening before he finally spoke again. "I'll do something good with it," he said, his voice quieter but firm. Barron gave him a knowing nod, then turned and started walking away. The crowd around them slowly parted, eyes still fixed on the scene that had just unfolded. As Barron disappeared into the city streets, a few people clapped. Not a loud, over-the-top applause, but something small, something meaningful. A few murmurs of approval, a few people shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Ryan stood still, looking down at the hat in his hands, then up at the direction Barron had gone. A few moments ago, he had been just another kid trying to prove something, trying to take what he thought would make him feel seen. Now, he wasn't sure who he was anymore, but for the first time in a long time, he wanted to find out. Not every situation needs to end in anger. Sometimes kindness disarms more than confrontation ever could. Next time you're faced with a choice, To react with frustration or to pause and understand, ask yourself, which response will actually change something? Because sometimes the smallest moment of patience can be the moment someone remembers for the rest of their life.